No.
As we show love to our neighbors, we're starting a brand new message series that's actually called How to Neighbor. What we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 of the most important and big issues in the world today and talk about how do we neighbor those that may need help or may be different than us. In fact, today I want to start with one that is a big subject and very important, and I believe that the church is called to be a part of the solution. The topic I want to talk to you about today is the idea of racism. Now, as we talk about racism, I just want to start by acknowledging that I have a very limited perspective, and so it's with a pure heart that I'm going to do my best to talk about a very, very important issue that I believe as Jesus followers, we need to lead the way in showing love to everyone. And I want to open up with a text, actually an encounter that Jesus had with a guy. Jesus tells a story that speaks to how to neighbor, and it actually deals with racism as well. If you have your Bibles, you want to follow along, we're going to be in Luke chapter 10, and there's an interesting encounter that Jesus has with an expert in the law. This guy comes up to Jesus and asks a question. The expert in the law says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus does what Jesus often does. He answers a question with a question. He asks the guy, "Well, what is written in the law?" And the guy responds, "Well, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus says, "Bing, bing, 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 bing. That's exactly right. You've nailed it on the head. Now go and live it. Go and do that." And the guy says, "Okay, I'm supposed to love God and love my neighbor." Then he asks a very pointed, very specific, very clarifying question. The guy in verse 29 wanted to justify himself, so he knows he's supposed to love his neighbor. He asked Jesus, what question? Ask it aloud with me. He says, "And who is my neighbor?" Okay, I'm supposed to love people, but who exactly do I have to love? Okay, if I'm supposed to love my neighbor, I need to know who is my neighbor. In other words, Jesus, do I have to love people that listen to the wrong kind of music? Because, I listen to the right kind of music. Do I have to listen to people that maybe weren't educated in the way I was educated? Because, I'm pretty important because I have an education and not everybody else does. Do I have to love them too, okay? Do I have to love people who have weird hair and tattoos and ear piercings, nose piercings, maybe even booby piercings? Did we just go there in church? Yes, we did. We're going to get real today. Are you with me? Can we do that? I don't know. It just happened. You can't take it back. It just happened. Do we have to love those people? Do we have to love them if they have a different accent than we do? If they speak a different language than we do? Jesus, do I have to love someone who has a different color skin? I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but I just need to know, who does that include? Who is my neighbor? What's interesting is Jesus doesn't answer the question about who to neighbor. What he does is he shows us how to neighbor. Jesus is going to assume everybody is your neighbor, and he shows us specifically how to neighbor, and he tells this story. He says there was a guy, and it was a Jewish guy who was going along to Jericho, and a band of robbers come and beat the tar out of this guy. Just beat the daylights out of him, leave him bleeding off in a ditch, and perhaps this Jewish victim is going to die if he doesn't get medical attention. Well, 2 guys actually walk by, and they both happen to be Jewish as well. One of them is a priest, and he sees his Jewish brother over there in the ditch bleeding, and what does the priest do? The priest kind of walks on by. And you could probably understand perhaps why, because if he got near a dead guy or touched a guy that was unclean, the priest would be ceremonially unclean, therefore he couldn't go to the temple that day. And so he could possibly justify why it would cost him too much to help this poor guy. Then a Levite goes by, another Jewish man sees the Jewish wounded man, and the Levite does the same thing. And pretends like he doesn't see him or whatever, and walks on by. Then Jesus says 3 words. And when he said these three words, it would have been jaw-droppingly shocking to his audience. What three words did he say? If you look in your notes, he said what? Say it with me. He said, but a Samaritan. One more time, not a Jewish man, but what? But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, what did he do? The Samaritan took pity on this poor victim, and he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, why was this so shocking? Jesus said, but a Samaritan man went to help the Jewish victim, and the reason this was shocking is because the Jews hated the Samaritans hated the Jews, and this was a 700-year hate fest. Why? Well, 700 years prior, whenever the Jews were exiled, some of them were left behind, and they actually intermarried with someone from a different race. They married people who worshiped pagan gods, and so when they reproduced, they had children that were from mixed races, and the one race worshiped pagan gods, so the Jewish people hated the offspring who were known as Samaritans, and since the Samaritans were hated by the Jewish people, they just did what we naturally do. We hate right on back, right? Because if you hate me, I hate you back, and that's what happened. 700 years they hated each other, and this Samaritan guy who would have been hated by the Jewish guy did one simple act. What did he do? Instead of walking this way, he walked across the street, and he took pity on another human being, and even though he was from a different race, this guy showed love to a man that was in need. Dr. Martin Luther King said this in probably his far most famous speech. He said this. He said, the first question the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? What will happen to me? Then he said, the Good Samaritan reversed the question and said, if I do not stop and help this man, what will happen to him? And this, in so many ways, is the heart of the gospel. It's loving God and loving others, even if they are different from us, and some might argue, especially if they are different from us. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Dennis Leary says this about racism. I thought this was really important. He said, racism isn't born, folks, it's taught. It's not born, it's not inherited, there's no racist gene. It's not born, it's taught. He says, I have a 2-year-old son. You know what he hates? Naps, right? If you got a 2-year-old, you know that, right? A 2-year-old doesn't hate somebody else because of the color of their skin. This is something that's taught. It's not something that is inherited. Why is it that people become racist over time? Well, I see 3 reasons. One is we're maybe a victim of hatred. Someone mistreats us because of the color of our skin. Someone mistreats someone that we love because of the color of their skin. And so we feel like, well, we can't trust them, therefore I don't like them and they don't like me. Second thing is it's taught. Well, in our family, we don't hang around those people. I mean, they haven't been to whatever, and we don't trust them, and they're all like this and whatever, and it's taught and handed down from generation to generation. The third thing is just ignorance. It's a lack of perspective. It's a lack of exposure. It's like, well, they're different, and so I must not like them. And no matter what the reason, we have to recognize this. If you're taking notes, and this is so important, is that racism is not a skin issue. Racism is a sin issue. Let me say it again. This is so important. We need to recognize that racism is not a skin issue. Somebody's going to help me preach this today. I can feel it. Okay, what is it? It is a sin issue. In fact, James 2:9 says this, if you favor some people over others, what are you doing? You're committing a sin. He said, you're guilty of breaking the law. Hey, I like you because you look like me. I mean, my kids can play with your kids because they look like my kids. I mean, we were educated in the same place. We look kind of the same way. We're kind of the same economic sphere. So, hey, but you're different, you see. You were raised on the other side of the street. Oh, you don't listen to the same music. Oh, you have a different color skin. Anytime we act like that, it is not a skin issue. It is a sin issue. We have to call it what it is. It is not right before God, and it should not be right before us. And that raises the big question. As Jesus followers, How are we called to love our neighbors? How are we called to love those who may look a little bit different than us? And I want to raise three very important issues today, and with God's help, we will get this right, and we will love our neighbors as ourselves. The first thing, if you're taking notes, and this is more difficult than it sounds, but we have to get this right. Number one, we need, with God's help, to be honest, to be transparent, to be sincere, and number one, recognize our prejudices. We need to recognize our prejudices. And this is really difficult to do because prejudices are so difficult to see in the mirror, because we often feel justified in how we might feel against someone else. And even if our prejudice mindset or our racist attitude isn't intentional, it's still real and it's still sinful. It could be totally accidental. In fact, I'll tell you a story that Pastor Danny Duran tells. He's one of our pastors. In fact, Pastor Danny and his team just launched the 25th Life Church location. Show some love for Overland Park, Kansas meeting today. We love you guys. Here's a picture of Pastor Danny with his kids. Pastor Danny was mowing his yard in his new house, in his new city, and somebody came up and said, "Hey man, how much do you charge to mow yards?" Okay? Now, when Pastor Danny tells this story, he kind of laughs and chuckles and didn't take tremendous offense to it. But what do we see? That's accidental racism all day long at its best. That's someone who really didn't mean to, but based on the color of his skin, made a judgment. And I'll just be real honest, let's call it what it is. No one's ever stopped me and asked me how much I charge to mow a yard. Could be because I don't mow my own yard, but that's besides the point. I did for years, okay? And no one ever asked me, hey, white guy, how much do you charge to mow the yard? And we have to call it what it is when we see it in our own hearts. This is wrong. It's prejudice, it's judgmental, it's racist, call it what it is. At its root, what does the word prejudice mean? This is in your notes. It means prejudging, okay? It's a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. And I bet most of you, if you had the courage to be really honest, you would admit that you were raised most likely with some type of prejudice. Why? Because we're sinful people and we are predisposed to making wrong judgments about people. I was raised in a household that kind of talked about, rich people are kind of greedy. Rich people are this and that. And that's what a lot of my friends, and that's what I grew up being taught to wrongly believe. Maybe you grew up thinking, well, heavy people are really lazy. The younger generation, they simply won't work. All mega church pastors are slimy, greedy crooks. Why do you guys laugh at that? Have you heard that? I mean, all of them are the same way, right? That's what a lot of people say. Old people, they're useless. They can't teach you anything. White guys can't jump. I don't know what it is, but you grew up thinking certain things about certain people, and we have to have the courage to acknowledge it, to admit it, to say, maybe I'm prejudiced about such and such. If you've ever said, I'm not racist, but, there is nothing good that comes after a but in that sentence. Nothing. Nothing, 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 nothing. I'm not racist, but, okay? You're racist, and you have to call it that at some degree, some level. We have to acknowledge it. This is challenging to admit, but I was part of a plane full of people that all made judgment based on the color of someone's skin. It was recently after the tragedy of 9/11. Just days afterwards, I was on a flight going somewhere, and if you remember, the airline industry was in shambles. Security was, rightly so, a nightmare and such. And so I boarded this plane. I was about halfway back, and a few rows in front of me, there was a guy that looked very Middle Eastern that boarded the plane. And everybody around me started kind of whispering. The guy sitting next to me go, we need to keep an eye on this guy. To make things even worse, he started sweating, and then he made a phone call and talked to someone in a language that was not our language. Then the guy deboarded the plane before we ever pushed off, and then he reboarded the plane. He was sweating, and I'm telling you, I don't know anybody on the plane that wasn't making some kind of plan to, defend, attack, whatever. The guy deboarded the plane, the door shut, and he never got back on. Now, what a lot of people would say, well, that's understandable because of the environment, okay? Call it what you want. there was a plane full of people that made a judgment based on the color of a guy's skin. Because I'm here to tell you, if he had been Asian American, African American, Caucasian American, everybody would have thought the dude's sick, he's scared, he's got diarrhea and he's a plug in his bottom, something's going wrong there. But nobody would have been afraid, and everybody was making a judgment. Why? Based on the color of someone's skin. It takes courage, it takes honesty, it takes integrity to recognize truthfully any prejudices, any racism, to admit it before God, and to repent of this. And we're going to talk about it in our life groups this week. We're going to be open, transparent, and we're going to find healing. Number one, we're going to acknowledge any prejudices. The second thing is we're going to seek to understand others. We're going to seek to understand others. Like I said at the beginning of this message, I have a very limited perspective, and I have to know that. And so I don't understand how others have been abused, mistreated, unfairly rejected, and on and on and on. And so it helps me to enter into dialogue with those who've experienced things far different than I have. And so that's what I did in preparation for this. I talked to a lot of people, and I learned so much that I didn't know. I just gathered a few of our staff members to ask them to help maybe you understand some things that maybe some of you don't yet fully understand. Well, I want to thank you guys for spending some time to help all of us understand. As we're talking about racism, we all come from different backgrounds and have different perspectives. What are some of the experiences that you guys have had?
Alan, George, and I, we tend to get confused for each other a lot. So Alan George is the church online pastor, and people will come up to me all the time and say, Pastor Alan, I watch you online all the time. And so
when there's a math question in the room, everyone's like, hey, Alan, can you? Like, I have no clue, man.
Like Mexican food. Hey, Sam, how do we season this meat? But I know.
I was like, come on, man. I look like Charles Barkley to everybody. So that happens to me a lot. But actually, mistaken identity is something that I've dealt with before. I used to be in retail banking. And I actually called somebody, and I was talking to them, and they actually came into the branch looking for Jeremy. And when they got there, and I said, I'm Jeremy, and they were shocked. They're like, whoa, you didn't sound like that you sounded like, and they caught themselves right before, you didn't sound black.
Almost makes you feel like you have to fight harder than everybody else and work harder than anybody else and study harder than anybody else just to get an equal opportunity.
Being a larger of stature black man and being a former athlete, you dress a certain way when you're outside of the professional realm. Well, I can tell you that there's been plenty of times when I've gone into a store and I've been browsing, looking around, and I find myself being trailed. And for some reason, I was like, okay, maybe they're just trying to give great customer service.
I get followed when I go into the store, and then my husband is white, so when he walks in behind me, then they kind of, okay, we don't need to follow her, she's fine, you know? So I get that too, and I'm a tiny little person.
You know, just different compliments, like if someone says, oh, well, you're beautiful, or you're intelligent, or something like that, but then the thing that also gets added to it is for a black girl. Mm-hmm. And I always, I remember the first time that I heard that and how that made me feel, like to think like, oh, well, I maybe rise in just this one section. But as far as like the, other standards of beauty, like, no, you don't have that.
So I know some of you would have experienced challenges as a kid growing up. Who has a story or two that was hard for you?
We came to America when I was 5 years old. And so the name calling from other kids was pretty challenging. We didn't quite understand why we were being called names like wetback or beaner. They made no sense to us. Those names made no sense, but something inside us I just knew, like, that's hurtful.
Where I was playing with some friends and, they had commented on it and were like, but she has dark skin. And then I'm looking like, what do you mean? Like, what's wrong with my skin? And that just created something that stuck with me for a really long time that I had to bring to the Lord and say, I need healing of this because I feel like I'm less than because of that.
Absolutely. I remember growing up in a predominantly white area of town and being on the playground, and I had a group of kids that wouldn't play with me, and I couldn't figure out what the problem was. And then as I was walking by, I overheard them say, man, my dad told me that we shouldn't play with niggers. And I was like, wow. I mean, it was, first of all, the first time that I was first reminded that I was black, and I had never been called that word before.
See, hopefully that'll bring a little understanding to some people who might not naturally understand, because I never faced that as a kid. In the second grade, I had someone turn away from me because of the color of my skin, and that gives me context. There's something else that's interesting I'll just share kind of almost off the record, but afterwards we sat down and had lunch together, and we were talking, and they told me stories that were much more severe than the ones that they talked about on video. And I said, how come you didn't share those stories? And they all said some version of, well, we want to be more a part of the solution than we want to be a part of the problem, and we didn't want to make people look bad. And that was interesting to me, that they actually held back because they didn't want to make people look bad. And I applaud them, as we as a church want to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. What do we do as Jesus followers? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to recognize any prejudices in our own life. Second thing we're going to do is seek to understand those who might be different from us. And the third thing, if we're taking notes, is this: we're going to love those who are different from us. Love those different from you. Love them deeply from the heart. This is what God calls us to do, to love those who are different from us.